In 1959, America was drenched in chrome, confidence, and horsepower. The highways glistened with tailfins that sliced the air like rocket wings, and every automaker wanted to build the next symbol of the American dream. But one brand, once dismissed as boring and outdated, was quietly preparing a comeback so bold that it would shake Detroit to its core. That brand was Pontiac. Just a few years earlier, Pontiac was the car your father bought when he couldn't quite afford a Buick and didn't want to admit it. It was safe, predictable, a middle-aged man's machine. But then, almost overnight, something changed. Pontiac transformed from a tired family brand into the face of youthful rebellion and performance. And the car that sparked it all was the 1959 Pontiac Bonneville, a masterpiece that didn't just save the company, but redefined what cool meant in America. The Bonneville wasn't just another pretty cruiser. It was a declaration, a bold message that Pontiac was done playing it safe. With its wide stance, low profile, and thunderous new attitude, it became a rolling revolution, one that challenged the very image of General Motors itself. But behind that transformation was a story of risk, rebellion, and a small team of visionaries who refused to let Pontiac fade into obscurity. What they built wasn't just a car. It was the birth of an era. And it all started when one man decided that good enough would never be good enough again. But to understand how Pontiac rose from dull to dominant, you first have to see just how far it had fallen. 1. The fall before the rise. By the mid-1950s, Pontiac was on life support. Within General Motors' massive empire, it sat awkwardly between Chevrolet and Buick, not cheap enough to attract young families, not luxurious enough to tempt executives. It was the forgotten middle child of GM, quietly fading into irrelevance. Dealers struggled to move cars off their lots, and even loyal customers were walking away. Pontiac's reputation had gone stale, its styling was bland, and its performance was anything but exciting. In an era where cars were getting bolder, lower, and faster, Pontiac still looked and drove like yesterday's news. Inside GM's headquarters, the future looked grim. Many believed Pontiac's best days were behind it, that the brand would soon be absorbed or quietly phased out. But then, in 1956, something unexpected happened. A new leader stepped in, and he wasn't interested in playing it safe. His name was Seaman Bunky Knudsen, and he was only 43 years old when he became Pontiac's youngest ever general manager. Energetic, fearless, and deeply ambitious, Knudsen had no intention of letting Pontiac die quietly. He wanted to build cars that made people feel something again, cars that looked fast standing still, that oozed confidence and power. Knudsen brought a radical vision. Pontiac would no longer be the brand of cautious, middle-aged drivers. It would become the car for people who love to drive, sporty, daring, and unmistakably different from anything else on the road. But he knew he couldn't do it alone. So he built a team of rule breakers. He brought in John DeLorean, a brilliant young engineer who thought about performance in emotional terms, not just numbers. And alongside him stood Pete Estes, a designer who believed that a car's beauty wasn't just in its shape, but in the feeling it gave the driver. Together, they would rebuild Pontiac from the ground up. Knudsen's orders were clear: lower the cars, widen the stance, give them power, and make them impossible to ignore. He wanted Pontiacs that didn't blend in on the street. He wanted cars that made people turn their heads and say, "What is that?" It was a dangerous gamble. GM's upper management wasn't thrilled about this rebellious direction. Pontiac was supposed to be safe, not fast. But Knudsen didn't care. He saw what was coming: a new generation of Americans who wanted cars that matched their energy and ambition. And in 1959, his gamble paid off. Pontiac's transformation roared to life with a car that embodied everything Knudsen had fought for: bold design, raw power, and undeniable confidence. The name of that car? Bonneville. And the team behind it would soon prove that Pontiac wasn't just surviving, it was ready to dominate Detroit. 2. The Dream Team: Knudsen, DeLorean, and Estes. When Seaman Bunky Knudsen took the reins at Pontiac, he didn't just bring new ideas, he brought revolutionaries. His vision for the brand wasn't to tweak or modernize the cars, It was to completely redefine what Pontiac stood for. And for that, he needed minds that could challenge the system. The first key player was John Z. DeLorean, a young, sharp, and somewhat rebellious engineer who didn't believe in limitations. DeLorean wasn't the typical GM man. He questioned everything, broke rules, and constantly looked for ways to squeeze more performance from ordinary cars. His engineering philosophy was simple. If it doesn't make the car faster or better to drive, it doesn't belong there. Alongside him was Pete Estes, Pontiac's chief engineer and later general manager. Estes had a deep understanding of how to turn wild ideas into reality without getting shut down by GM's corporate politics. He was the bridge between Knudsen's bold vision and DeLorean's restless innovation. Together, this trio became the heartbeat of Pontiac's rebirth. Knudsen brought the authority and ambition, DeLorean brought the daring, and Estes brought the strategy to make it all work within GM's cautious hierarchy. Their first step? Change Pontiac's entire identity. They ditched the dull chrome-heavy designs and replaced them with low, wide, aggressive-looking cars that shouted confidence. They re-engineered the suspensions for real performance, giving Pontiac a ride that could handle curves as well as straight-line speed. And under the hood, they began experimenting with larger, more powerful V8 engines that made noise, power, and attitude part of the driving experience. But DeLorean had one idea that truly defined the new Pontiac spirit, something radical that would change everything: the wide-track design. This wasn't just marketing talk. By widening the car's stance, the distance between the left and right wheels, DeLorean made Pontiacs more stable at high speeds, sharper in corners, and visually more muscular. It gave the cars a stance that looked planted, confident, and unmistakably different from anything else on American roads. Knudsen loved it. Estes approved it. And GM, despite its usual resistance to change, couldn't argue with the results. When the 1959 wide-track Pontiac hit the streets, people noticed immediately. It didn't just look fast, it was fast. Sales skyrocketed, and for the first time in decades, Pontiac wasn't the forgotten brand anymore. It was the one everyone was talking about, bold, fresh, and thrillingly different. But Knudsen and his team were just getting started. They weren't satisfied with being noticed. They wanted Pontiac to dominate. And to do that, they would have to take their fight to the racetrack and prove to America that Pontiac wasn't just about looks. It was about power. Racing, rebellion, and the birth of a legend. By 1960, Pontiac's transformation was in full swing, but Knudsen knew that real credibility didn't come from advertisements or showroom talk. It came from winning. If Pontiac wanted to be seen as a true performance brand, it needed to dominate where speed mattered most, on the racetrack. The problem? General Motors had an official ban on factory-backed racing. Corporate policy forbade any direct involvement in motorsports, no sponsorships, no funding, no official participation. On paper, Pontiac was supposed to stay far away from the track. But Knudsen and DeLorean weren't the kind of men who followed rules they didn't believe in. Quietly, they found ways around GM's restrictions. Knudsen used marketing budgets and backdoor channels to support independent race teams. DeLorean supplied them with factory parts, engines, and technical advice, all off the record. It was a bold act of rebellion, and it worked. Soon, Pontiac began showing up at NASCAR and NHRA events, tearing up the competition. Cars like the Catalina and Bonneville became monsters on the track, powered by massive 389 and 421 cubic inch V8s that could leave even the most confident Ford and Chevrolet drivers stunned. The turning point came in 1961 when Pontiac made a statement at Daytona. The sleek, wide-track Pontiacs weren't just fast, they were dominant. The Catalina stormed through the field, and by the end of the season, Pontiac had earned something far more valuable than trophies: respect. Suddenly, Pontiac was no longer the boring middle brand. It was a force. It was power, performance, and precision wrapped in bold styling. America began to associate the Arrowhead logo with speed and excitement. And that reputation exploded with the introduction of the Super Duty program. DeLorean and Estes developed a range of high-performance engines and parts that turned ordinary Pontiacs into fire-breathing machines. These engines weren't designed for the average driver. They were built for racers, tuned for power, and capable of jaw-dropping acceleration. Pontiac Super Duty cars, especially the 421 SD Catalinas and Tempests, became legends almost overnight. They weren't just fast, they were feared. But this underground racing empire didn't stay secret for long. GM executives eventually caught wind of Pontiac's unofficial racing activities, and pressure mounted to shut it down. The official ban returned in full force by 1963, forcing Pontiac to step away from the tracks it had dominated. Still, the damage, or rather the impact, was done. Pontiac had changed its image forever. The once-forgotten brand was now America's performance darling, admired by racers, teenagers, and anyone who loved speed. And even though GM tried to silence the racing program, DeLorean had no intention of slowing down. He was already working on something that would take Pontiac's rebellious image to a whole new level, a car that would break every rule and start a cultural movement. The car that would bring raw power to the streets, not just the track. The name of that car? GTO. 4. The GTO Revolution and America's Muscle Car Awakening. By 1964, Pontiac was no longer the quiet middle child of General Motors. It had swagger, confidence, and a rebellious streak that refused to fade. But John DeLorean, ever the rule breaker, wasn't satisfied. He wanted to bring racing performance to the streets. To him, cars shouldn't just look powerful, they should feel alive every time you hit the gas. So when GM issued an internal rule banning midsize cars from having engines larger than 330 cubic inches, DeLorean saw it not as a restriction, but as a challenge. Working alongside engineers Bill Collins and Russ G., he found a loophole. Instead of making a brand new performance model, they would simply take the existing Pontiac Tempest Lemons, drop in the 389 cubic inch V8, and make it an option package. That way, it didn't technically violate GM policy, at least not on paper. And with that clever workaround, the GTO was born. The name, short for Gran Turismo Omologato, was borrowed from Ferrari, a bold move that screamed confidence. But what truly mattered was how it drove. The GTO combined muscle, style, and affordability in a way no American car ever had. It wasn't just fast, it was accessible. A young buyer could walk into a dealership, tick a few boxes, and drive out with a machine that could smoke cars twice its price. When the GTO hit the streets, it was an instant sensation. Pontiac expected to sell around 5,000 units that first year. They sold over 32,000. The car was a phenomenon, not just a product, but a statement. It symbolized freedom, rebellion, and raw American power. Magazines couldn't stop talking about it. Car and Driver famously tested a GTO against a Ferrari GTO, and while the Ferrari still had the edge, the comparison alone was revolutionary. Pontiac had created a car that made ordinary people feel extraordinary. The GTO didn't just make Pontiac famous, it lit the fuse for an entire movement. Soon, Ford, Chevrolet, Dodge, and Plymouth all rushed to create their own muscle cars. The horsepower wars had officially begun. For Pontiac, this was their golden era. Their cars, from the Bonneville to the Firebird, became symbols of cool. Their ads were bold, their styling aggressive, and their attitude unmatched. Under Knudsen, DeLorean, and Estes, Pontiac had gone from bland to legendary in less than a decade. But as the GTO roared through the 1960s, a darker cloud loomed over the horizon, one that would soon test everything Pontiac had built. Because the same rebellion that made Pontiac unstoppable was also the reason its empire wouldn't last forever. 5. The fall of the muscle era and Pontiac's identity crisis. As the 1970s rolled in, Pontiac was on top of the world. The GTO had become a cultural icon, the Firebird was catching everyone's attention, and the brand sales were stronger than ever. But behind the smoke and roaring engines, the world was starting to change, and Pontiac was about to face a storm it couldn't outdrive. It began with politics, pollution, and panic. In 1973, The OPEC oil crisis hit, and suddenly America's love affair with big engines turned sour. Gas prices skyrocketed. Long lines formed at fuel stations. The same people who once bragged about quarter-mile times were now worried about miles per gallon. At the same time, new emission regulations and safety standards came into play. Automakers were forced to add heavy bumpers, catalytic converters, and attuned engines to meet the government's new rules. The muscle car, once the symbol of freedom, was now being strangled by bureaucracy and efficiency mandates. Pontiac, the brand built on power and speed, was hit the hardest. The mighty GTO that once ruled the streets was reduced to a shadow of its former self. By the mid-1970s, the legendary 389 and 421 engines were gone, replaced by smaller, weaker V8s that couldn't live up to the name. And just like that, the brand's identity, built so carefully by DeLorean and Knudsen, began to crumble. Adding to the chaos, John DeLorean left GM in 1973, frustrated by corporate politics. Without his bold leadership, Pontiac lost its edge. The company that once broke rules now followed them. Its cars became safer, slower, and, worst of all, forgettable. The Firebird Trans Am tried to keep the dream alive. It became a pop culture hero thanks to movies like Smokey and the Bandit in 1977, where Burt Reynolds made the black and gold Trans Am look untouchable. For a moment, Pontiac felt cool again, but it was a temporary high, not a real comeback. The brand was fighting against a world that had moved on. The oil crises of the late 70s, coupled with a growing demand for smaller, fuel-efficient imports from Japan, left Pontiac struggling to find its place. The car that once embodied raw American spirit was now caught between two eras, too wild for the new, cautious America, and too watered down for the fans who remembered its glory days. Pontiac had survived wars, recessions, and rivalries, but now it was battling something far more dangerous: irrelevance. Still, the name refused to die quietly. Even as the company stumbled, there were still sparks of rebellion, designers and engineers who remembered what Pontiac once stood for. And in the next chapter, one of those sparks would reignite America's love for the brand once again. Because just when everyone thought Pontiac's best days were behind it, the Firebird would rise, quite literally, from the ashes. 6. The Firebird, the Phoenix, and Pontiac's last great comeback. By the late 1970s, Pontiac was barely hanging on to the performance image it once owned. The muscle car era had crashed, regulations were tightening, and buyers wanted practicality over power. But one car, one symbol, refused to surrender: the Pontiac Firebird Trans Am. If the GTO was the spark that ignited Pontiac's golden age, the Trans Am was the flame that refused to go out. With its screaming chicken decal, aggressive hood scoop, and unmistakable stance, the Trans Am became the outlaw hero of a generation. It was fast enough to feel rebellious and flashy enough to turn heads, even if it wasn't as wild under the hood as the 1960s beasts. Then came 1977, and everything changed. The movie Smokey and the Bandit hit theaters, and suddenly, Pontiac was cool again. Burt Reynolds, with his mustache, charm, and black and gold Trans Am, turned the car into a pop culture icon overnight. Sales exploded. Pontiac dealers couldn't keep up with demand. For a moment, the brand was reborn. The Trans Am was the dream car for anyone who wanted to feel unstoppable, the symbol of American rebellion, freedom, and style. But Pontiac's revival wasn't just about one movie. It was about a feeling, that same sense of attitude and boldness that had defined the brand in its heyday. Through the 1980s, Pontiac doubled down on its "We Build Excitement" slogan, offering cars that tried to blend performance with modern design. Models like the Grand Prix, Fiero, and Firebird GTA kept that image alive, each one carrying a piece of the old Pontiac spirit, daring, loud, and unapologetic. The Fiero, in particular, was one of the most ambitious cars Pontiac ever built, a mid-engine sports car designed to fight imports head-on. Though plagued by reliability issues early on, it showed that Pontiac still had innovation in its DNA. But by the 1990s, cracks began to show again. GM's cost-cutting decisions and badge engineering turned Pontiac's lineup into a mix of rebadged Chevrolets with extra body cladding. The rebellious soul that once defined the brand was fading into corporate sameness. Still, every now and then, Pontiac reminded the world of what it once was capable of, like the 1998 Firebird Trans Am WS6, a snarling V8, powered beast that could outrun many modern sports cars. It was a glimpse of the old magic, but the world had changed too much. As the 2000s approached, GM's focus shifted to other brands, and Pontiac, once the heartbeat of American performance, was quietly sidelined. The final blow came in 2010 when GM, struggling through bankruptcy, officially shut down Pontiac. For car lovers, it felt like losing a piece of history. A brand that had once dared to challenge Detroit's biggest names, that had redefined American performance, and that had made speed and style accessible to everyone was gone. But legends never truly die. Pontiac's legacy lives on, not just in museums or garages, but in the hearts of those who grew up idolizing its cars. The Bonneville, the GTO, the Trans Am, they weren't just vehicles. They were statements. Dreams on wheels. And while the badge may have disappeared, the spirit of Pontiac, rebellious, innovative, and unapologetically bold, still echoes through every muscle car that dares to push the limits today. Because once you've built excitement, it never really fades away. Pontiac's story isn't just about cars. It's about attitude, vision, and the courage to break rules when the world says don't. From a fading, forgotten brand in the 1950s to a performance powerhouse in the 1960s, Pontiac didn't just build machines. It built a movement. A movement that turned ordinary drivers into dreamers, rebels, and believers in speed, style, and freedom. The 1959 Bonneville marked the turning point, the moment Pontiac shed its conservative skin and embraced boldness. Then came the GTO, the car that rewrote the rulebook and sparked the muscle car era. Even when the world changed, through oil crises, regulations, and the rise of imports, Pontiac never stopped fighting to stay relevant, to stay exciting. It stumbled, it adapted, and it evolved. And even when it fell, it did so with character, the kind of flair only Pontiac could pull off. The Trans Am, immortalized in Smokey and the Bandit, gave the brand its final breath of glory, reminding everyone that rebellion doesn't die quietly. Pontiac's journey was a mirror of America itself, bold, imperfect, and always chasing something bigger. Its legacy isn't measured in sales charts or production numbers, but in emotion. Every roar of a GTO engine, every burnout from a Trans Am, and every fan still polishing their Bonneville decades later, that's Pontiac's heartbeat still echoing. So, when you see one of those arrowhead badges gleaming under the sun, remember, it's more than metal and horsepower. It's a story of reinvention, rebellion, and relentless passion. Pontiac may be gone from the factories, but its spirit still burns on the streets, in every driver who believes that cars aren't just for transportation, they're for transformation. Because once upon a time, a group of dreamers decided that boring wasn't an option and they built excitement that would last forever. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more forgotten legends, iconic machines, and untold automotive stories. This is Gear Ghosts, where the past never stops moving.